2025 Dr. Melvin L. DeFleur Distinguished Lecture. My name is Michelle Amazine. I'm the director of the CRC and Associate Dean for Research for the college. I'd like to extend a special welcome to any of you joining us from outside of the College of Communication. Before we begin, I have a few housekeeping items to go over. If you are in possession of anything that beeps, boops, clicks, or does anything like that, makes noise, could you please silence it as we are recording this talk today? And if you are taking a comm class and you're looking to earn SONA research participation credits, make sure that you have checked in with our staff today so you can get credit with your, make sure you have checked in with your BUID. And speaking of our staff, I would like to thank them. I see Amanda King, our lab and research manager, running around. I see Ming Yu Palmer, and we also have Yoonhee Choi and Ramona Che. They all are instrumental in making these events happen. So thank you very much. And after today's lecture, I invite all of you to join us upstairs in COM 209 for some food and refreshments. And you'll have the opportunity to speak one-on-one with our guest of honor. The DeFleur Lecture Series began in the fall of 2009 and is named in honor of the pioneering communication scholar, Dr. Melvin L. DeFleur, who was our colleague here at Boston University for 10 years. Today, I'm delighted to introduce our distinguished speaker, Dr. Brooke Duffy. Dr. Duffy is an associate professor in the Department of Communication at Cornell University. She completed her Ph.D. at the Annenberg School for Communication at the University of Pennsylvania, and also holds a Master of Arts from Penn, as well as a Bachelor of Arts from Penn State University. Duffy's research explores the role of social media in work, employment, and society. She is the author or co-author of 3 books, including Not Getting Paid to Do What You Love, Gender and Aspirational Labor in the Social Media Economy from Yale University Press, which Wired magazine named as one of the top 10 books of 2017. Her most recent book, Platforms and Cultural Production from Polity, with Thomas Pohl and David Nieborg, has been translated into Italian and Chinese. Her current book project, The Visibility Bind, Creators and the Perils of Platform Labor, which is under contract from the University of Chicago Press, draws upon interviews with social media influencers, creators, and streamers to explore the promises, perils, and paradoxes of work in the creator economy. Dr. Duffy has published in many of the Academy's top media and communication journals. In addition to her academic publications, she has disseminated her research to a broader audience through the popular press, writing in venues such as The Atlantic, Vox, Salon, Wired, among others. In 2024, she joined Forbes as a regular contributor. Today, Dr. Duffy is here to present some of her research from her book project, The Visibility Bind. Please join me in welcoming Dr. Brooke Duffy.
Thank you for that introduction, and thank you for being here today. How's the audio? Is that too loud? Good? Okay, yeah, I'm absolutely delighted to be here, and before I present my talk, I want to just extend a word of thanks to the folks who I met today, and especially to Amanda King and to Michelle Amazine, the Associate Director of Research. And I don't know if you all know this, but she had a book that just came out yesterday called Content Confusion. And so I'm thrilled to be presenting the DeFleur Lecture, and I got a chance to hear a little bit about Dr. DeFleur's legacy today. And I think it's fair to say if he was trying to situate my research in the broader field of communication, which many of you are well familiar with, he would situate me in the critical cultural studies area. And what that means is that I'm very interested in the role of power relationships underpinning various facets of culture, and in this context, the creator economy. And so as someone who studies the media, I am very keenly attuned to media narratives that circulate about the creator economy. So let me share with you a few of these. So on one hand, the creator economy is cast as this entrepreneurial promised land, right? We have $500 billion circulating to content creators, at least according to Goldman Sachs. There's been a huge uptick in jobs, 7.5 times increase since the pandemic. This is seen as a place where young people, the narrative is your generation are all clamoring to be creators and influencers. And it's really seen as a place where creativity flourishes, income opportunities are rife, and there's this potential for self-actualization. So that's one narrative. The second set of narratives that circulate sort of dispels this myth of an entrepreneurial promised land by highlighting the less auspicious characteristics, including the fact that the creator economy is mired in inequity, thinking about gender and race-based pay gaps, suggesting that the creator economy is much less democratic than the platforms would lead us to believe. And years after this account of creators who were burning out and breaking down, burnout and mental health challenges have become perhaps endemic in this space. This is a recently published study suggesting that half of creators experience burnout. And this anecdote here I thought was quite compelling because there's this narrative of people are leaving the 9 to 5, which doesn't love you to join the creator economy. And here we have someone who's, to use a Silicon Valley favorite euphemism, pivoting back to a traditional 9 to 5 because the creator economy has lost its luster. So we might be tempted to think that, let me move this a little bit. I feel like I'm hearing a really weird echo. Okay, so we might be tempted to think this is like false consciousness, right? That these jobs are trying to lure everyone to enter this space, and creators don't realize the challenging or inauspicious characteristics. But I think this fails to acknowledge the fact that there are so many patterned systems of inclusion and exclusion within the creator economy. And so to make sense of these contradictions, I want to introduce this concept of the visibility bind to suggest how we can better understand some of the contradictions that exist among influencers, creators, and other forms of, are we good?
Yeah, I'm just gonna turn this.
Okay, perfect. How's that? Yeah, I think that's better. Great, thank you. So I'm going to talk about this concept of the visibility bind and hoping that that helps to make sense of these contradictions and contestations. And so just to give you an outline of where I'm going to go with my talk in the next 40 minutes or so, first I want to begin by talking about my research, what gives me the authority to make these claims because I am not a creator myself. And then I want to think about how understandings from sociology and mass communication in terms of regimes of visibility can help us understand what's going on in terms of these contradictions. And then I'll introduce the concept of the visibility bind. And I want to end on a more optimistic note by showing what creators are doing to contest some of the realities and inequities within this space. So first I've been throwing around this term creators, and what do I mean? Well, in a recent article, Craig and Mirlis argued that there really lacks terminological coherence. How many of you feel like you could offer a clear, succinct definition of creators? No, this term is thrown around. I mean, the idea is, like, are we all creators now? Essentially, it is a category that has overlaps with influencers, with live streamers, with artists, with educators. What I'm interested in is the work and labor that folks do in this space. And so with my colleagues, we argue that creators are platform-dependent workers. And so what that means is that despite the fact that they are seen as entrepreneurial, bootstrapping, independent workers, their careers are contingent on big tech platforms. And so they are bound by the infrastructures, by the governance, by the advertising decisions. And so against that background of having creators as platform-dependent workers, they're not legally employed by the companies, but they are dependent on them. I've spent the past 5 years interviewing creators, platform representatives, intermediaries, talent agents, behind the scenes and behind the screens workers. And I want to contextualize this that most of my research, though not exclusively, focuses on the US context. And I really sought to center the experiences of marginalized creators, influencers, and streamers because there's this narrative that it is an egalitarian space where anyone can participate. Well, is it really? By centering the conversations and experiences and conditions of people of color, of the LGBTQ+ community, of women, of persons with disabilities, I think we can get a fuller picture of this space. And I also draw upon an analysis of creator newsletters for those of you who are interested in this space, the information, the published press, passion fruit. These are essentially publications for creators or by creators to get a sense of what's going on behind the scenes. Visibility is such a capacious word. It's a kind of fraught concept, and so because, as I said, I'm coming from media studies, how can we use the tools and language of media studies to make sense of visibility? In my work, I draw on two particular definitions. One is thinking about the politics of visibility, who is seen and conversely not seen within the media, and what does this suggest about social positions in the wider world? The second draws on Sarah Bene-Weiser's concept of economies of visibility, where individuals within a particular economic context pursue visibility because it's linked to individual rewards, not collective representation, but visibility is, in Bene-Weiser's term, an end of itself rather than a means to an end. And I've also found this notion of promotional regimes of visibility really productive for thinking about why it is that we all use this concept of visibility in different ways, to different ends. And so they talk about the promotional regimes of visibility, where in one sense, visibility is seen as something that is ephemeral. Hey, I went viral today, but now it's missing. It's something that provides empowerment, right? I am seen, therefore I am valued, but also as an ultimate aim, again, within the job context. And so I draw on their framework to think about how platforms and creators circulate and construct visibility in ways that help structure this broader system. So let's start with visibility as recognition, and then I'll talk about visibility as representation and visibility as regulation in turn. The platform rhetoric is visibility is about recognition. And so I think it's really compelling that, especially in the wake of the pandemic, companies like Snap and X and Meta have all tried to get in the creator space by luring folks to join them and post content in hopes that they too will become the next big thing. I mean, this is from Meta. What a seductive lure where you can access a range of monetization tools, earn money doing what you love. And so creators, to be eminently visible, are compelled by platform companies to put themselves out there. And platform companies uphold and contribute to this mythos of a talent meritocracy, where if you have the most creative content, whatever that means, you too can rise to the top. So this is from YouTube. This is in its creator tips. Encourages you to be authentic, be yourself, adding audiences feel more engaged when a creator is comfortable and authentic. What makes you excited? Share that with your audience. Your viewers can tell when you're passionate, and passion is infectious. So here, the end goal of authenticity is to draw an audience. And the narrative may best be summed up by this idea of if you produce good, authentic content, the audience will come. Many of the creators I spoke with didn't see it this way. They said they were producing what they understood as original and authentic and good content, but yet their numbers didn't rise. They felt stuck. And so this is a comment from Dave, a fashion and lifestyle influencer who paid for verification status on Meta. You may or may not know, you can pay, I think it's like maybe $14 and become verified on Meta. So Dave did that, still wasn't successful. He said his content he saw was very creative, but it wasn't drawing the numbers. And so he said, I reached out to the people there and said, what can I do to improve my reach? And they're like, make better content. I said, what can I do with that? That's vague. There's clearly something happening that isn't just, I need to make better content. And so David was really frustrated by this notion of a talent meritocracy because it defied his experiences working in this space. But what really got to him was the algorithm. And so if any of you full-time creators? Aspiring creators? A few of you? The preoccupation with the algorithm, of course, right? How do we think about being seen? Well, the algorithm operates under what Tina Bucher calls the looming threat of invisibility. And so Dave was one of the creators who talked about how spinning out by this preoccupation with how to curry favor with the algorithm, or what Connor calls the visibility game. And so we think about the fact, and platforms pitch to us the fact that you put creative content out there, but so many creators actually have this preoccupation with the algorithm because this determines recognition rather than putting out good content. And so not only is this narrative of recognition defined by the fact that platform algorithms shape the contours of success, but there are many people working in tech companies that actually cherry pick talent. So what happens in many cases is through their talent programs, through strategic partnerships managers who are scouting new participants in this space, platform companies perform very much like an artist and repertoire scouting process, one that is largely concealed behind the scenes. And so we think of everything as running kind of in a neutral tech meritocracy, but the human agents working at these companies play a very direct role in allowing folks to be boosted or seen or rendered more visible. And so here I have a quote from an educational creator, and I said, why do you think you were chosen? She was hand-plucked to be part of the featured TikTok creator. And she said, I think they have an incentive to prove that TikTok isn't this horrible addictive thing for Gen Z kids to be exposed by doing dances right. I also talked to a number of creators from marginalized communities who felt that they were hand-selected because they engaged in they were able to do some kind of box ticking. So I talked to an intersex creator who said, Instagram picked me because I was one of the few folks that meet this demographic category that is going to enable them to put up my face and name and likeness as part of this program. And so that brings me to the second form of visibility. Visibility is representation. This is a well-worn narrative within the media industries. And so despite the fact that platforms are forums for self-presentation, they're also places where the politics of representation play out. And so crucially, when I began my research in 2020, nearly all platform companies had initiatives that were earmarked for Black creators. These lasted, perhaps not surprisingly, until the latest DEI retrenchment, which I will talk about shortly. But in addition to supporting creators of color, they also have initiatives to support Pride, to support women, to support other marginalized and disenfranchised communities. And so what these programs offer is incentives, dedicated support, platform funding. But there's a sense of hypocrisy underlining these programs. For one, nearly all of them fizzled away under the current administration, and so since 2025, most of these programs have been axed, or in the case of Meta's program, the website no longer exists. But you can get a sense of this kind of narrative offering they did. So this was in 2020. Meta had committed $25 million to Black creators to support the Black community. And they go on and offer this social justice appeal saying we want to elevate your voice and hear your thoughts. Twitch, too, has offered dedicated support for marginalized communities. And here you can see a quote from Ellie. She was actually selected by the platform to be featured on a billboard in Times Square, but also to have her content boosted and appearing on the landing page of Twitch. And as she said, Twitch does these special things like Black History Month. She said, and if you're not part of these programs, it's really hard to be seen, this notion of discoverability. She said that's because Twitch has put you in front of a larger audience more consistently. Some streamers were quite perplexed about why they were selected for these programs, and I love this quote from Christine, who said, Christine was a trans TikTok creator. I was very confused why, despite the fact that she gets her videos taken down all the time by the platform, they featured her as one of their Trans Day of Visibility creators. And so again, we see the kind of unraveling here of the purported promise of democracy and the realities of platforms' relationship with creators. And so this is the case I mentioned a little bit ago. Creator Mag did a feature on what happened to the DEI initiatives at Meta, and as you can see, they put the $25 million, and 4 years later, all the funding dried up, and these programs, again, have really shifted under the current administration. And so I like this quote from Herman Gray because it draws attention to the very vexed nature of the politics of visibility. So, as Gray wrote in 2013, does increased visibility and recognition in media and cultural representation produce new forms of subjection and regulation? So yes, you're being seen, but by who? Perhaps not surprisingly for anyone who is on social media, hate, harassment are rife. But if your livelihood depends on this, you have far fewer options for blocking, banning, filtering out hateful content, because to do so risks losing the numbers that maintain your livelihood. And so just a few quotes here from creators I interviewed about this endemic harassment that was normalized as part of their job. As Liz said, being a female in that space, you're very much harassed, like go back to the kitchen, make a sandwich, what are you doing? Winnie, meanwhile, told me about this part of her community that posts progressive feminist content. And what happens is you're dealing with this version of harassment. And one of the, especially alarming elements that emerged from interviews is how many people told me that they felt that platforms incentivized hate and harassment by putting them on quote unquote the wrong side of the algorithm. And so what would happen is someone here, like Winnie, would post progressive feminist content, and her perspective was that TikTok would deliberately put this on conservative talk in order to amplify the engagement and grow her numbers. So finally, I want to think about, yes, visibility functions as recognition within an individualist neoliberal economy. Visibility is also cast as a path to representation, though one in which also entails the risks of being hypervisible. But visibility also functions as regulation. Platforms moderate content. This is widely commonly understood as how they create and govern. They create rules for what counts as hate, harassment, misinformation, increasingly AI use, sexual content. And they create and enforce these norms in ways that are fickle, they're constantly changing, but they're also highly uneven. And so Kaplan and Gillespie talk about this notion of tiered content moderation, where if you're considered a public figure, which is a quite nebulous term, then the moderation of your content is going to be different from an ordinary user. But what happens is creators exist in this kind of fuzzy gray area where are they public figures, are they not? If you are in one of the more privileged elite positions, you don't have to worry about content moderation guidelines in the same way that a creator does. But creators' livelihoods are, again, dependent on what is made visible or conversely invisible. So Phil told me, clearly the celebrities and people with a big audience, they have more leeway in what is approved. And I did this interview with Phil a few years ago, and in the year since, Meta and X have both, through, in some cases, leaked documents, been open about the tiered content moderation, or the fact that they offer different, or they provide differential treatment. And I heard time and time again about these issues of uneven content moderation, especially for marginalized creators or those working within stigmatized spaces. And so this is a quote from Carrie, who was an adult entertainer, and she had 4 million followers on Instagram, and said that she repeatedly woke up and had her account taken down, despite the fact that she said she followed every guideline. She's like, I religiously follow their guidelines, and my account is still taken down. And she said, it was devastating and tearful and emotional and scary, because my livelihood is dependent on this account, and I wake up and the account is gone. Many other creators reported experiences of shadow banning. I imagine most of you are familiar with this term, but if you're not, it's essentially where your content is receives reduced visibility, or is completely banned, but you are not notified. And so all of a sudden you see your numbers go down, but there's no notification that you've violated any guidelines. And so I've talked to, this is such a polarized content among creators, and I'm happy to talk more during the Q&A, but essentially, Nina was among those who said every single time I say anything critical about how the algorithm is different for people of color, I always get hit with a violation or shadow ban. And so the idea here is that Nina was biting the hand that feeds her, right? She was saying something critical and calling out the perceived inequities in TikTok's algorithmic system, and her content disappeared. Ziggy Tyler told me that this experience happened to him so many times that he ended up not using hashtags, which are a kind of key mechanism of visibility, because of the fact that he would be unevenly, or because of his experience that he would be unevenly shadow banned. And so Ziggy talked about fears of ending on the wrong side of TikTok. He said, if I want to talk about something pertaining to Black identity or queer identity, I'll say it in the video, but I won't use the hashtag, because I know it's just going to get stunted more than it should. And so when I offer these accounts, the narrative is, oh, well, maybe these people are complaining, there's no evidence. Over the years, through leaked documents and the admissions of platform companies themselves, a number of instances highlight the wider patterns of inequity that are structured into this. And so here, this is Naomi. Here we have a case of LGBTQ creators, and here we have a case of TikTok moderators. And I don't know if folks remember this, this was in 2020. Leaked documents revealed that folks working for TikTok were explicitly told to ban anyone, I think it was ugly, LGBTQ+, or disabled. I may have the quote right. The quote slightly misremembered, but essentially guidelines for workers are told who should be visible and who should be invisible based upon their social identity characteristics. And in all these cases, the platforms issue an apology, but we don't know what goes on behind the scenes. And so in all of these cases, I've been talking about the impact of the regulation of content, to use Tarleton Gillespie's framework. But of course, when we're thinking about regulation, platforms are also bound by what happens in the larger socio-technical legal system. And so, the looming threat of a TikTok ban is frustrating for anyone who uses the platform for connectivity or information or education. But again, if your career depends upon it, how do you make sense of this volatility in ways that provide you a sense of stability in an already precarious career field? And so this quote from Mia talked about how, the platform feels like it can arbitrarily be taken away. It's dependent on the algorithm and US-China relations and Congress. She said, just being a creator inherently exposes you to platform risk. And so how do we make sense of this? Again, I don't want to dismiss the fact that the creator economy offers very real material and social benefits for participants, but at the same time, there are these instances where we hear differential views, we hear about inconsistencies, and we hear about downright brazen issues of bias. I think we can make sense of this in the context of what I've been calling the visibility bind, which emerges from the cultures, economies, and governance of social media platforms, where creators find themselves trapped between these two risk-intensive conditions. On one hand, they are faced with the imminent threat of content moderation or punitive shadow bans, and so they're overwrought by this fear of invisibility, but at the same time, they confront the pitfalls of hypervisibility too, from surveillance to commercial appropriation to trolling and identity-based harassment. And so the irony here, of course, is that platform policies remain shrouded in secrecy. Their algorithms are impenetrable, their content moderation guidelines are elusive and kind of updated at a breakneck speed, and their spaces remain under-regulated in the face of hate and harassment. And so one way to make sense of this, as I said, is this notion of the visibility bind, but thinking about this on a longer timeline within the nature of work where hypervisibility and invisibility are seen as contrast to a worker ideal of visibility and represent different manifestations of the same oppressive forces, subjugation and devaluation. Okay, so I just laid out some tough stuff. Where do we go from here? So I always like to end this talk on thinking about how creators, as you can probably tell, I'm very much committed to the working conditions of social media creators, perhaps overly sympathetic. But what are creators doing to push back, given the fact that they are platform-dependent laborers? Well, there's some creator practices that are emerging that challenge or even subvert platforms' visibility practices. And I'll talk about a few very quickly, and again, I'm happy to talk more in Q&A, in terms of unions, collective action, engagement groups, which attempt to strategically enable creators to work together and to sort of game the algorithm. So-called algo speak, where if you want to communicate to your audience but don't want to get dinged by the algorithm, you use these sort of coded words. The big one, like by now, of course, platforms have caught on, was using SEGGS instead of SEGs, because the idea is like, well, you can't post sex because you're going to get dinged by the algorithm, but like SEGGS is one of those workarounds. Invisibility boycotts. And so over the years, we've seen the rise and in many cases fall of creator unions. These are a few formal organizations. I am on the board of the American Influencer Council, I should say that. The Internet Creators Guild, the YouTubers Union, the Creators Guild of America, the Congressional Creator Congress. These initiatives are trying to remedy the fact that creators are geographically dispersed, platform-dependent workers who do not have a shop floor on which to organize. And so how do we bring them together to advocate for their working conditions? But these, of course, face challenges. I love this quote so much, where I was talking to someone who was involved in the early organization of one of these groups, and I was like, asking about how he's like, one of the challenges is you're doing organization work and you walk into a Las Vegas mansion and try to tell a 19-year-old about solidarity. It's a hard sell. So how do you get people who are the most visible within this space to join the cause? And there's a conspicuous absence of the union label in many of these, and I think that's quite strategic, and it is resonant with how legacy media industries tend to use guild, because union is much more associated with blue-collar work. But one of the most promising spaces that I see is the fact that platforms are creative workers who know how to use communications par excellence. And so the idea of autonomous communication, which is written about by Brophy and colleagues, is the idea that media workers, and I would extend this to creators, can reclaim the skills of their trade to raise the profile of activities that endanger not only their livelihoods, but those of a larger group of workers amid generalized precarity. And so these are a few examples that I explore more in my research where creators have called out these working conditions. And they've drawn attention to the fact that, yes, despite the fact that they are dependent on these platforms are not creating everyone equally. The Black TikTok strike, Ziggy Tyler, who I mentioned, called attention to the sort of stunning issue of racial bias baked into the algorithm. We've seen creator boycotts, especially on Twitch. And so all of this suggests that if there's anyone who's going to change the working conditions, it's the participants within the system. And I want to close with this quote from Blair Amani, who I interviewed a couple months ago. And we were talking about this, like how do we redress the fact that creators exist in a state of precarity that is not well understood outside this space. And she said, we have to think about organizing history, which has typically held that it's not led by people with Ph.D.s and tons of access. It's been from the scrappy people who have the most to lose. And so on that note, I want to end with a few concluding thoughts. One is just over the last 5 years, platforms have pivoted from this focus on scaling up users to putting the creators or the aspiring creators at the center of strategy. And so the reasons that social networks that once billed themselves as places to make connections are now in the creator game is perhaps not surprising. Creators furnish this built-in audience. And as YouTube learned early on, a platform is only as good as the content. And so it does make sense that big tech companies are recruiting independent artists and entertainers and educators in earnest. But along with the promises, many find perils, including those conditions of invisibility and hypervisibility that I mapped out, which means many folks find themselves trapped in a visibility bind, especially marginalized creators. But there is this more optimistic read where platforms, by giving creators the tools to monetize, have also enabled them to call out the injustices. And so, I close by thinking perhaps platforms have created a visibility bind within which they find themselves trapped. So I appreciate your attention and happy to answer questions.
I see a question over here.
Thanks so much. This is really interesting. I'm hoping you might talk a little bit about how theoretically the concept of visibility bind is distinct from or perhaps overlaps with the double bind.
So so thanks for that. The double bind is this idea that people find themselves in two opposing contradictions. And I see it very much a form of a double bind where you can't win. And so creators are trapped in this situation where if they do anything that is seen as too egregious, that is defying the codes of authenticity, that is too aligned with commercialism, they're going to experience calling out. But at the same time, if they do anything that is defying the platform codes, they're going to be punished, they're going to see their numbers decline, they may lose advertising sponsorship. So it's very much, I see it a trap. The difference is it's hinging on this notion of visibility. Yeah, thanks.
Thank you.
Thank you, Dr. Brooke Duffy. So my question is about AI. So in your research, how are creators negotiating authenticity in an environment where their feasibility is increasingly shaped not only by algorithmic platform algorithm, but also by the rise of generative AI. And also, my second part is how they see AI, whether it's a complementary for their creative tool or as a competing force as a more synthetic virtual creator.
Both. No, I mean, they are struggling through it like the rest of us, and I think AI has become a touch point, especially in the context of labor. Perhaps not surprising, and I saw just yesterday Meta actually announced that they're launching a tool for creators to take more ownership over their content that basically will alert them if anyone tries to steal their content using AI. So that's interesting given the politics of how platforms are trying to align themselves with creators. But in terms of the bigger question, so since I've completed these interviews, I've been working with a few collaborators where we're interviewing creators, especially about this context of making sense of AI in their work. And I mean, the reactions are quite polarized. Some of them are like, absolutely, it's a tool. Others are, the same narratives we all have. Others are saying, no, this is going to completely ruin the ecosystem, and I'm especially concerned about the potential for copyright violations. And where I think it plays out in the context of visibility is it intensifies both of these situations. And so think about the risks of hypervisibility. I mean, what is a bigger risk of hypervisibility than a deepfake or a non-consensual image-based abuse? And so there's that element of it. On the invisibility side, we see the same sort of situation where now it's not just the combination of human moderators and automated systems, it's AI that is increasing or decreasing content. So I see it exacerbates it. But I guess the other part I'll say is my colleague Catherine Sender talks about this notion of the pitch, which is when you're interviewing participants within a space that they have a sort of marketing orientation in their work. Of course, they're going to be selling you a particular narrative. And so when you're talking to a creator, this is a space that is predicated on authenticity. And what threatens authenticity more than AI? And so thinking about how they strategically recalibrate their work practices. So I think it remains to be seen, but I think visibility is kind of a vector.
See a question over here.
I had a question. How do you feel about the acquisition that Larry Ellison and his son have had on the majority of mass media outlets, including TikTok?
I think in any context, we're thinking about monopolies versus freedom of speech, how that discourse is playing out. I think we've seen it in the context of Twitter, where look at the evolution of that. Since, when was the Musk takeover? 2022? It was never a kind of creator hub, but it certainly was a space where journalists went, where people made connections and saw networking. And then with the takeover, it became a place where many creators retreated. At the same time, the platform was trying to woo Mr. Beast and paying him to get on there. And I think it very much depends on the creator's politics, right? And so I think the same thing is playing out. Is this a creator that wants to be associated with a particular political ends, and who's their audience? Because even in this context, we're talking about it as kind of like a monolithic category of creators. And it's, again, a capacious category. Are we talking about entertainment creators versus news creators? And I imagine many of you saw this, I know Michelle knows this, 1 in 5 Americans rely on news creators to get their information, and so thinking about that breakdown there. Yeah, thanks.
Thank you.
Thank you, Dr. Duffy, for this excellent speech. I have 2 questions. One is, to what extent you think the visibility could be part of the governance framework?
So visibility is part of the
As a
governance?
part of the governance framework, so for the platform governance perspective, how they actually perceive visibility, they have to cover this regime of audience traffic, online environment, and from the content creators' perspective, how they consider visibility as a way for them to present it, as you said, recognized, presented, and regulated by the platform as well. And to extend also as a governance framework to just the normal users. Like, do they actually also perceive the sense of visibility in the use of the social media, whatever? My second question is, I'm very interested in the last part of your talk. You mentioned like the content creators, they have a chance to get together and maybe create a certain resilience to this control or governance by a platform in terms of visibility. To what extent do you think they will be able to resemble this similar logic of, say, for example, connective action? They'll actually be able to do a substantial resilience to a platform and gain a control over visibility to their usage of the social media. What is just a force consciously say it?
Yeah, I'll start with the second question. It's challenging for a number of reasons, including, as I said, the fact that workers are geographically dispersed. They are very independent, and so it is, the quote about it being a tough sell. How do you encourage someone who is in this precarious position to join collective activism? Also, when you're thinking about resilience, there's usually a central figure, but here we're talking about workers who are working across 3, 4, 5 different platforms. And the frustrations that they feel are directed both to the platforms, but also to the brands. And so there's this kind of dispersal of logic. One of the things that, or one of the spaces that may provide some hope of this sort of resilience is the fact that, and I just saw this, I think yesterday, but the WGA and a number of the guilds and organizations associated with Hollywood and legacy media are now courting creators. And so trying to present a unified front, I think that might be a space where creators can kind of leverage their awareness and understanding of the platforms, whereas legacy media knows about the logics of guilds, the importance of protecting workers. But in all of this, I think you need to have, this is a visibility economy, as you said, so you need to have the big creators on board, and that's always been challenging, and even in the case of the YouTubers Union, like Hank Green spearheaded it, who was, very, very well known, and it still fizzled out after a few years. And so I don't know what the tipping point is. We keep seeing the emergence of this, and then they fall out. In terms of the comment, the question about governance, I think that's an important one, and there's a really smart paper by, I forget, Bondi K and his colleague, where they talk about visibility moderation, where the idea is the entire ecosystem is less about content moderation and more about visibility. How seen are you, or how not seen are you? And we're thinking about the context of how do we understand the dynamics of an ordinary user who is paying attention to governance versus a creator. And so I haven't interviewed the ordinary user, but my assumption is they get frustrated when their content is being seen or when they're not getting a lot of views, but it's not financially incentivized. And so they are not doing the work to go in there and read the content moderation guidelines. Like, creators are spending hours going in there and poring over the specifics and going on a Reddit chat and trying to make sense of how to translate a particular thing. And so this investment, the material investment they have, the emotional investment they have, is quite different from the ordinary person who's like, oh, that sucks, my content got flagged. And it's like, what can I do about it? Yeah, maybe I'll report it, but I think the level of investment is different. Yeah, thanks for that.
Oh, thank you so much. Yeah, this was an amazing talk. I was actually thinking through policy-wise, and Europe has DSA now, which has much different rules. So do you think that could be an option, to push the platform's hands, basically, going through, looking at what they're doing, what other, organizations are doing, what other governments are doing, basically, because U.S. is behind DSA, way behind, yeah. So I was thinking, what do you think about that?
The U.S. is certainly behind in terms of tech regulation, and I know in 2021, I was part of an inquiry by Parliament that was about influencer conditions, and we still haven't seen any sort of massive attention from the U.S. regulatory context, except for TikTok, where the focus tends to be on users and thinking about the context of ownership rather than the rights of creators. I will say that just maybe about a month ago, this was on it was framed as a small business issue, which may work within the US context a little better because it plays into the narratives of capitalism. So that was a space where like maybe it's taken seriously, but there is such a gap in understanding. The census does not include creators within them, so we don't even have a scale. Like every other week there's a survey, it's like 50 million people are creators or 67 million are creators, but where is this coming from? A lot of it's coming from industry reports, and so there's a kind of industrial self-sustenance is part of this. But yeah, I think the US is quite behind in terms of regulation, and I mean, I'm very much for regulation. I've been in touch with folks, and I think it's still, there's this gap in like, who does this work? The frustrating like hand-wringing, like, oh yeah, kids are just posting and making $5 million, and it's like, no, that is not how it works. This is a profession, but yeah, thanks.
Other questions?
I really appreciate how you focus on the agency of the creators, and I'm curious about the other side of that coin. And I'd like to hear you talk a little bit about a sort of wider culture of visibility, or if you see that and the way in which the motivations of the creators or individual creators might be a bit alienated from the means of production in this case, and are drawn by a culture of visibility that has other consequences beyond the individual. So I know your work is focusing in on the agency, but I just wonder where the limits of that are. And I noticed early on in the talk you sort of went back and forth between using the word labor and work, and I think for like Hannah Arendt makes a really big distinction between those terms, and and are these laborers? Are people working so far removed from the meaning that is provided to them because they're sort of wrapped into this cultural system, or not? So sorry, that last part was a bit rambling, but you get my point. I want you to talk about the culture of visibility, I guess.
Oh yeah, I spend way too much time thinking about the culture of visibility because I think, I'm an academic, as you probably figured out by now. Academia is under the same circumstance, but I don't want to say all, many professions experience this same culture of visibility where, within the past 15 years, in part spurred by Silicon Valley, everybody wants to be an entrepreneur. Everyone is told to put themselves out there and burnish a self-brand, and so the costs of opting out are profound. And it's really hard when you think about the toll this takes for anyone, regardless of your orientation, to operate under this logic. Sophie Bishop has a book that just came out called Influencer Creep. It talks about how the artists, the fields of art are reconfigured by the logic of influencers, but I would say that most fields are, right? Because we all need to have a social media presence. We should be on LinkedIn and thinking about what we post getting us fired or hired. And so I think, one source of this entrapment is, of course, like the neoliberal job economy, where it puts it all on us. And the second is the platform companies that are telling us that you too can do it. And so when thinking about the broader question of this culture, something that people ask is like, haven't folks always wanted to be actors and actresses or athletes, and that only one is going to make it, and we know it's hyper competitive? And I was, yes, of course, but the difference is the platform companies are peddling this narrative that you too can do it in a way that Hollywood wasnwasn't directly to us, and so that's what feels different. But yeah, all of this, I've written a few things on like the self-promotion logic of academia, and it is the exact same situation, except that it doesn't matter as much, though it kind of does, how many followers we have on social media. It's more about our citations. So it's a parallel self-branding discourse that infiltrates so many spaces, and it's exhausting. That's my happy take.
Any questions from back here? So I was surprised to hear you say that you don't consider yourself a creator. I know that you write for the popular press and then you promote it like on LinkedIn, but I was surprised to hear you say that. Can you talk a little bit more about that, why you don't consider yourself one? Well, I guess you defined it earlier because you're not dependent upon a platform for your work.
Yeah.
But can you link that, can you talk about that a little bit more and expand a little bit more on academics and how they are encouraged to share everything online?
Share everything
Share their
online.
work.
Yeah, I think, and when you raised that question, my thought is like I create research. Of course, I'm a creator, right? But the notion of a social media creator, I think about it as my initial thought was it's about putting the person out there rather than the ideas. And like I share my my family and cat on social media, but like I'm like, for me to do what a number of folks do, a number of academics do, which is like academic TikTok. I'm like, oh, that just seems so stressful for me. And so I think something about the whether we're talking about text or images or a more Reels format is where my immediate thought went when we're trying to understand this difference. But yeah, I mean,
You do or don't do academic TikTok? You
No.
do or you don't? Okay.
no, I don't. And I left Twitter. My Instagram is like my cute kid and my cute cat, and Halloween, that kind of stuff. But so no, but I mean, the shift that I have seen in the last 5 to 10 years where, yeah, I mean, Instagram is like, you know, people are putting their work life, and so it's putting their careers in, you know, you just had a book come out, I'll have a book come out, and like your publisher is telling you, you need to write op-eds, you need, I mean, I don't know about you, but on my book contract, they asked how many Twitter followers I had. This is for a university press. And, you know, again, talking about the reality is like, publishers aren't doing the marketing for you, it's you do it yourself. Academic universities are losing staffers, including the fantastic people who do media relations. So that's all on you. And so I think, you know, going to your question about the wider economic circumstances that impel us to take on this labor ourselves, there's a push from below, but there's this push from above where the institutions are not doing it, and so I'm saying you need to do it or else, you know, what is a greater fear than being invisible?
Thank you. So it is 4:30. Let's give a nice round of applause for Dr. Duffy. I invite you all to join us upstairs in Com 209. We'll have some refreshments, some drinks, some food, and you can talk to our guest speaker one-on-one.